Hello, everyone. I think we can start. Thank you for joining. Hello to everyone. We are pleased to welcome you to the data collection webinar series organized by the Data Collection Unit at UNICEF New York headquarters. We are very happy to present the second webinar today after resuming the series 3 weeks ago this year. My name is Turgay Ünalan. I'm in the Statistics and Monitoring Section Data Collection Unit, UNICEF New York headquarters. This winter and spring series will be covering topics that have recently gained relevance and importance and where there is ongoing work on how best to collect data. Today's topic is using pregnancy stories, the experience of the DHS program. Before starting, I would like to mention a few housekeeping rules. We have scheduled about an hour and 30 minutes today, including Q&A. As always, in these webinars, throughout the webinar period, you will remain muted automatically, but kindly write your questions in the chat box. We will try and group your questions and direct them to the presenters during the Q&A. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our SharePoint site together with the past webinars. We will also post recordings onto the Mix YouTube channel, and so they are publicly available. You can find the links to both of these in the email that you received. As I mentioned earlier, today's webinar is titled Using Pregnancy Stories, the Experience of the DHS Program. We are very happy to have with us Trevor Croft, Chief of Data Quality, DHS Program. Trevor Croft is a Senior Technical Director with ICF International, working on the Demographic and Health Surveys Program, providing technical assistance for the implementation of household surveys. He has 42 years experience in international survey data collection, processing, analysis, and dissemination of results, having worked with DHS from 1987 to present, with a short break from 2003 to 2008. Previously, Trevor was Chief of Data Processing for DHS for 16 years. He developed easy access to DHS datasets through www.dhsprogram.com and to indicators and tables through www.statcompiler.com. From 2003 to 2005, Trevor was Chief of Strategic Information at UNICEF, New York, responsible for statistics and monitoring of the situation of children and women, including reporting on progress towards the MDGs and producing the statistics for the annual State of the World's Children report. He also oversaw the implementation of the Multiple Indicator Cluster Surveys program and the continued development of DevInfo for monitoring the MDGs. Trevor started his career as a data processing specialist for the World Fertility Survey program. Trevor, thank you for joining us. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Turgay. It's kind of scary to hear that resume and how long I've been doing this. So, thank you all. I want to give you today a little bit of the experience of the DHS program in the use of pregnancy histories. Historically, the DHS program has used a birth history for the capture of the fertility of the respondent and information about the mortality of young children. However, a good number of surveys had used a pregnancy history in the past. In DHS 8, and the DHS program is in its 8th phase, known as DHS 8, and these are 5-year phases roughly. In DHS 8, the DHS program replaced the birth history with a pregnancy history in the standard questionnaire. And I should note, and I'll come back to this a bit more, that the pregnancy history is actually a history of pregnancy outcomes not just of pregnancies. There is one entry in the pregnancy history for each pregnancy outcome, including separate entries for each twin or triplet. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. If you'd like to take a look at the questionnaires, they can be found here, and it might be easier for you to read the questionnaires if you've got a copy that you can access. And I can show you very briefly how to find those. If you go to dhsprogram.com, and under methodology, you'll find questionnaires and manuals. Once you're there, you want to access the DHS survey questionnaires. And you want the core questionnaires for phase 8, which are shown here on the right. And you'll find a long list of questionnaires in English and French here. The one we're interested in is the women's questionnaire for DHS 8 in the PDF format. And that will bring up the questionnaire. And the parts we are interested in today are Section 2, reproduction. This is the lead-in to the pregnancy history, and then on the following page starts the pregnancy history. So this is what the birth history looked like in the DHS 7 questionnaire. That's the previous round of DHS. It starts with a series of questions that leads into the actual birth history. Starts with a set of questions that are commonly known as the brass questions. This series of questions on the left here, which ask about the number of sons and daughters living with the respondent, number of sons and daughters who live elsewhere, and the number of boys and girls who have died. And the purpose of these questions is an introduction and to get a total count of all of the births that the respondent had in their life. It also serves to prompt the respondent for the information that we are looking in. So it's not just those who are living, and it's not just those that live at home with the respondent that we are interested in collecting data for. Once you've collected this information on the left and you get the total number of births, we then go to ask about each of the births, and there's a series of questions that are asked for each one. These are summarized on the next screen, basically collecting the name of the child, the sex, whether the birth was a multiple birth, that is twins or triplets, or quadruplets, for example, the date of birth, whether the child is alive, the age of the child, if the child is still alive, and whether they are living with the respondent, and for those children that died, the age of death. The pregnancy history in DHS 8 is a little bit different. We continue to have the brass questions as the introduction to this section, but these are augmented with a couple of questions about pregnancy losses, and then a total sum of pregnancy outcomes. That's all of the living children plus all of the pregnancy losses, gives you a total pregnancy outcomes. So that, again, introduction into the pregnancy history. And then the pregnancy history is split into 2 pages in the paper version of the questionnaire, with more detail in it. And I won't go through this in detail, but I'll summarize it in the next slide. So the pregnancy history, in place of information about whether it's a multiple birth, we now collect information about multiple pregnancy outcomes. And this is slightly different. In the with a birth history, a multiple birth is a birth that resulted in twins or triplets of live births. In the pregnancy history, when talking about pregnancy outcomes, they would also be considered as a multiple pregnancy outcome, but so would an outcome that resulted in 2 stillbirths, for example, or a stillbirth and a live birth. That would be considered a multiple pregnancy outcome. With the birth history, a stillbirth and a live birth would only be considered as one live birth. The stillbirth would not be considered at all, and it would be considered a single live birth. So there's a difference there. We collect the outcome of the pregnancy, and we collect it as the respondent responds. That's not necessarily the way that we will ultimately be using the data. And we capture whether it's a live birth, a stillbirth, a miscarriage, or an abortion. For stillbirths, we asked if the baby cried, moved, or breathed. We asked the name, the sex, and the date of birth as we did in the birth history. But for pregnancy history, we also asked for the date of end of pregnancy for those pregnancies that didn't result in a live birth. In addition, we collect information on the duration of pregnancy in weeks or months. And we reclassify the outcome per the DHS definition, and I'll come to that a little bit later. And then finally, we have information about whether the child is alive, the age, if living, and whether living with the respondent, and the age at death. And those last 4 sets of information are the same as with a birth history. So the motivations for using a pregnancy history. For us, we had previously estimated stillbirth rates using data from a contraceptive calendar that is collected covering the 5 or 6 years preceding the survey. With the pregnancy history, we can do a better job of estimating stillbirths, and we can avoid a couple of limitations that we had with the calendar data. So calculation of stillbirth rates is one of the important motivators. We also believe this should get us more complete fertility histories, which should result in better fertility and child mortality estimates. We also collect information on antenatal care and delivery indicators, and we're able to now produce those indicators for stillbirths as well as for live births. And finally, using the pregnancy history, we can estimate abortion rates, although typically these are largely underreported, and we would probably only recommend calculating abortion rates in countries where abortion is legal, because it tends to be severely underestimated in many other countries. So what do we get that's different? So here's a couple of the tabulations that we're able to produce now that we were not, just as an example. You can see that we produce a stillbirth rate now as part of a perinatal mortality tabulation. In total, more than 20 tabulations in our tabulation plan are changed or affected by the introduction of stillbirths. And there's another example here is an antenatal care, which is produced for live births, stillbirths, and then the combination of live and stillbirths. And many other tables that are affected or can be produced using the stillbirth data. Now, I want to note here the pregnancy outcomes. We're seeing that somewhere between about 87 and 92% of pregnancy outcomes result in live births, and stillbirths only account for 1 to 2% of all pregnancy outcomes. Miscarriages It seems to vary between about 5 and 10%, with most surveys probably hovering around 8% of pregnancy outcomes being miscarriages. And abortions are less than 1% are reported as abortions in most surveys. It's a little higher in countries where abortion is legal. So training on the pregnancy history is an important element in the training for a survey, for a DHS survey. And whether training on a birth history or a pregnancy history, it's quite complicated. The training it's probably one of the most important pieces of the questionnaire. And it's not a simple thing to train on. Having said that, training on a pregnancy history is only somewhat more complicated than the birth history. Most of the complications you have are the same between the two, so there's not a huge difference. But it is somewhat more complicated. You're obviously asking more information. In the training, we have to introduce these various new concepts that would not be previously used when using a birth history. Firstly, the idea of the pregnancy outcomes, and that it's not just pregnancies. So one pregnancy might result in 2 or 3 pregnancy outcomes if they're twins or triplets. We also need to discuss the definitions of the stillbirth and miscarriage, and respondents may report stillbirths as miscarriages and miscarriages as stillbirths. That's quite common that they use a different, they may use a different assumption of what the stillbirth or a miscarriage is than the definition that we use. The CAPI system that we have, that's the computer-assisted personal interviewing system that we use, automatically uses the DHS definition, and we'll come to that a little bit later. So it's not crucial that the interviewer understands the definition, because it will apply this definition. However, it's still important that the interviewers do understand it. Thirdly, we're also talking about duration of pregnancy, and that's most frequently reported in months. While many of us would like to see that reported in weeks, in reality, the respondents just don't know the duration in weeks. They know the duration in months. And fourthly, and I mentioned this before, multiple births are used in the birth history, and that's just twin or triplet live births. In the pregnancy history, we use multiple pregnancy outcomes, and that might be twin or triplet live births, but it might be twin or triplet stillbirths, or a combination of live birth and stillbirth twins and triplets. So that concept is a little bit more complicated than it is when you're using a birth history. We have quite a lot of training materials that we use as part of the training process. We have an interviewer's manual that is quite detailed concerning how to interview using the pregnancy history. Actually, it's for the whole survey, but not just the pregnancy history. We use mock interviews quite extensively in PowerPoints, and we've been increasingly developing videos for how to collect the data. And I'm going to very briefly play a little segment of this one video for you. Let me just cue it up. Oops, wrong screen. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. We're here today to talk about pregnancy outcomes. Pregnancy is a term I'm sure you're familiar with, but pregnancy outcome you may not be. A pregnancy can have 4 types of outcomes. Does anyone want to make a guess of what they are?
Do you mean how many babies a woman gives birth to?
Partially. A baby, which we refer to as a live birth, is a pregnancy outcome. Any child who shows signs of life by crying, breathing, or moving, even if they only survive for a few minutes, is a pregnancy outcome that is classified as a live birth. But in addition to a live birth, there are 3 other types of pregnancy outcomes. What are they?
A miscarriage.
That's correct. A miscarriage is when a woman's pregnancy ended early and involuntarily, before 7 months or 28 weeks in the pregnancy. Some countries have different cutoffs.
Another outcome could be an abortion.
Yes, an abortion is when a woman voluntarily ends the pregnancy. Any ideas about what the final pregnancy outcome would be?
Would that be a stillbirth?
Yes, that's right. A stillbirth is when a pregnancy lasts for 7 months or more, or 28 weeks or more, and the woman gives birth to a child that shows no signs of life, otherwise known as born dead. Those are the 4 types of pregnancy outcomes.
Okay, so that was just to give you a taste of the types of videos that we are producing as part of, to be used in training. So there are a number of challenges that we address in the collection of the pregnancy histories. I mentioned this before, but one of the key ones is the need to think in terms of pregnancy outcomes, not just pregnancies. And that can be a source of confusion in training. It can also be a source of confusion for the respondent to a certain extent when you're talking about pregnancy outcomes, not just pregnancies. Talking about miscarriages can be very hard in an interview. Miscarriages account for between 5 and 10% of the pregnancies. And respondents may be sad or upset when discussing miscarriages. So that's an important element. That's also true of stillbirths too. But stillbirths are very much an important part of what we want to collect. While miscarriages, we don't really do much with the miscarriage data. So it can be a difficult piece, a challenging piece for interviewers during the interview. Reporting of the duration of pregnancy, as I mentioned, that's typically given in months, as respondents don't know how many weeks. It would be a lot simpler for us if respondents did know exactly how many weeks, and we could be more precise in our definitions of what's considered a stillbirth or a miscarriage, if that was the case. But unfortunately, very few respondents respond in weeks. So this is the definition that DHS applies. And it's not necessarily what the respondent reported. So a respondent might have reported that they had a stillbirth, but if that stillbirth cried, breathed, or moved, then we consider that that pregnancy to resulted in a live birth, even if the child died almost immediately. A reported stillbirth or miscarriage of 28 weeks or 7 months is considered a stillbirth. And those of shorter durations we consider as a miscarriage. So we differentiate between miscarriage and a stillbirth at 28 weeks or 7 months. And this is based on the WHO recommendation for international comparison. Many countries actually use various different definitions of 20, 22, 24 weeks for their definitions of when what's considered a stillbirth. But for international comparison, WHO has recommended 28 weeks. And we use this definition for our definition of a stillbirth in the DHS program. Induced abortions, if they say it's an induced abortion, we don't change that. That is kept as it is. And the questionnaire reclassifies the outcome in question 223. It's not really a question, but in the filter instruction 223 in the questionnaire. Some of the other challenges, collecting data on induced abortions is can be really challenging. Underreporting of abortions is very common. But to be honest, it's also true of stillbirths and miscarriages. Underreporting is fairly common in those as well, but more so with abortions. In countries where abortions are illegal, surveys often do not differentiate between miscarriages and abortions in question 216 and 223. In those questions, we just call them pregnancy losses, and then an additional question is used on the end of the pregnancy history, just for those that says, did you or someone else do something to intentionally end the pregnancy? And we use that to determine whether it's considered an abortion or not. So this is a slight adjustment to the questionnaire that we make in some surveys. Data quality. So data quality is a concern when introducing a new approach. It's always going to be a concern, and we had some concerns about introducing the pregnancy history as a standard in the DHS questionnaire, but we used it quite extensively in prior surveys before DHS 8, and particularly those in the former Soviet republics, where abortion rates were quite high. So we had, a fair amount of experience with it. So far, I would say there's no evidence that the quality with a pregnancy history is worse, but I can't actually say that it's necessarily better. The results we've seen so far have mostly been fairly consistent with prior surveys. So it appears that the quality is pretty good from the pregnancy histories, and where we do see quality problems, it's not driven by the birth history or the pregnancy history. It seems to be driven by other factors that will affect quality, not just in the pregnancy and birth history, but across other parts of the questionnaire as well. We have plans for an analysis in the next year looking more closely at data quality of pregnancy histories using the earliest DHS 8 surveys. We don't yet have any DHS 8 surveys released. They will start being released in the next couple of months. We have about 3 or 4 that will come out in probably next 2 or 3 months. And we'll be using those to take a look at the data quality. We'll also be producing sample analysis plans for using the pregnancy history data as part of that exercise. People have been interested in the duration of the interviewing for the pregnancy history, and it's only slightly longer than for the birth history. As I mentioned before, about 87 to 92% of pregnancy outcomes are live births. So those would essentially be the same in the pregnancy history as they are in the birth history. Stillbirths only account for a small percentage, miscarriages for 5 to 10%, and a very small number of abortions. So the total number of pregnancies you're dealing with is only slightly more than the number of births you would be dealing with. So you've got a slight increase there. You've also got a few extra questions in there, but actually not that many. So our experience has been that we really haven't noticed much difference in the duration of the interviewing. We don't have exact numbers yet, but it's not really been a noticeable difference in the duration. I wanted to talk a little bit about the CAPI system and how the pregnancy history affects that. This is just a screenshot of what the the data collection looks like, and I'm going to try and demo this briefly towards the end. Just to give you an idea of what the CAPI system looks like. For the pregnancy history, we made a number of changes to our CAPI system, a number of improvements to facilitate the collection of the data in the pregnancy history. Some of this has been things like improved menu options for inserting, deleting, or reordering pregnancy outcomes. It's quite important to be able to correctly order the pregnancies as you're collecting the data, and it's not unusual that the data are collected out of order. So having the ability to rearrange them during the interview is quite important for collecting complete and accurate data. We've also improved the interface we have for reviewing the complete pregnancy history and allowing the interviewer to sort of check the work that they're doing. We've improved the consistency checks and actually modified the consistency checks we have between what are known as the BRAS questions, which are now questions 201 to 212 in the DHS 8 questionnaire, and comparing those with the pregnancy history. In the past, we used to require that an exact match between the BRAS questions and the birth history questions. That is, if the BRAS question said that there was if it said something like there were two sons living at home, then we would check the birth history to ensure that the birth history had exactly two sons living at home. And if there was one daughter living away, it would check that there was exactly one daughter living away. And it would require consistency between these two pieces of information. Now we've relaxed that check so that we use the BRAS questions as lower bounds. That is, that the pregnancy history we're now collecting, if the BRAS question said there were two sons living with the respondent, we would now check that the pregnancy history had at least two sons living with the respondent. We permit additions in the pregnancy history that may not have been mentioned in the BRAS questions that preceded them. And this is quite important. It avoids the interviewer having to go back and making corrections to the earlier questions, and permits adding or inserting pregnancies in the pregnancy history that the respondent might not have mentioned before. However, having said that, interviewers typically do go back and update those questions, even though we tell them they're not required to. We've also made a couple of other small changes that are tweaks. One of those is that we allow twins not to be delivered on the same day. Previously, we would require twins to be recorded with exactly the same date. Now we allow for a one-day difference. And here, just as an aside, we've heard some interesting stories since we introduced the pregnancy history. I think everybody seems to know somebody who has an aunt who had a stillbirth at 7 months and then a live birth at 9 months from the same pregnancy. And this is something that's very tough to sort of handle well in the CAPI systems, but it's something that we hear lots of stories about. We don't currently permit that. We use basically the same end date for the pregnancy for both in this case. If we did not do that, I think these cases are so rare that if we did not do this, we would find a lot of erroneous cases with very different dates for the twins, and so we don't permit that because these strange cases are a very rare example. Here's just a brief example of the consistency checking that goes on in the CAPI system. In this example, two births were entered first in the pregnancy history, and then a miscarriage was added, but the date of the miscarriage places it between the other two, and the system provides an error message saying the date of the end of pregnancy is not in order, and provides three options. One is to correct the date of delivery of the pregnancy in question, which is the miscarriage. One is to correct the date of the prior delivery. That would be the date of birth of Beatrice. Or the third one is to move the pregnancy, that is to move the miscarriage and place it before the birth of Beatrice. So this is just an example of the kind of consistency checking that's built into the pregnancy histories. In the data processing that follows the data collection, we have strengthened the consistency checks and the imputation of the dates of the pregnancies, but really that's very similar to the approach that was used in the birth histories in the past. So it's not a huge change in this process. We do impute incomplete dates. So if you have we allow respondents to say that they don't know the date of birth or date of pregnancy, and using information about the surrounding births and other information, we impute a date of birth or a date of end of pregnancy for every pregnancy. We ensure that pregnancies are given in chronological order, and you saw an example of that. And we ensure that there's a minimum gap between the pregnancies. With a pregnancy history, that gap used to be at least 9 months. But with a birth history, at least 9 months. But with a pregnancy history, pregnancies can be closer spaced together there. And now we just require that the gap must be at least the duration of the following pregnancy. But that duration could be only 3 or 4 months, for example. And after using the consistency checks, the imputation takes place within the logical ranges that are constructed from the full pregnancy history and perhaps some other information as well from outside of the pregnancy history. So that's not hugely different from what we did with the birth history, but it is a little bit different because of the durations of pregnancies. I think I want to give you a quick demo of how the data capture is going to work, and I'll just bring this up. So this is the data capture system that we use, the CAPI system that we use. It's very similar, I think, to what is used in MIX in many respects. We're both using CS Pro as the software for data collection. I'm just going to go through a simple example so you get a feel for how the pregnancy history is collected. So we start asking about all the births that the respondent had in their life and whether they've ever given birth. And we're going to say yes to this. And then we ask about the sons or daughters that the respondent had who are living with her, and then we will be asking also about those that are living elsewhere. In this example, I'm going to say that there was one son living at home and there's one daughter who died. So I'm going to use this example for now. So yes, there's one son living at home. Number of sons, it's slightly off there. Number of sons living at home is 1. Number of daughters living at home, 0. No sons or daughters living elsewhere. So that skips 205A and B. Have you ever given birth to a boy or girl who was born alive but died? Yes, there was one daughter that died. So 0 sons, 1 daughter. And you've had 2 births, is that correct? Yes. And then we ask about miscarriages, abortions, and I'm going to say no here, and we'll come back to this in a minute. So then this leads us to the pregnancy history. And now we're going to enter information in the pregnancy history, and then doing this in 2 blocks. So this first block up to 222, we collect information about the pregnancies, and we'll collect for all pregnancies in that block first. And then the questions 223 to 228, we will collect that in a second block. So we read the intro to the respondent, and then you come to the first question about whether the pregnancy was a twin or triplets or quadruplets. We can say this is a single. The child was born alive, and we'll give the name Andrew. Is Andrew a boy or a girl? That's a boy. And let's say he was born on the 5th of April 2020, and he was born at 9 months. And there was no pregnancy before him. And then there was a second pregnancy. It was a single pregnancy. It was also born alive. The name was Beatrice. She's a girl. And let's say she was born in the 11th of October 2022, and 8 months. And then we say, were there any previous pregnancies between the previous pregnancy and this pregnancy, and say no here. And now we've got a complete record for the 2 that the respondent reported. And we ask, have they had any pregnancies that ended since the last pregnancy mentioned? And perhaps here the respondent says, oh, wait a minute, I had a miscarriage. And so now we've got to add in the miscarriage, and we've got a couple of ways we can do it. We could go back up to here and insert before Beatrice, but we can also enter it here, say yes here, enter it. We're going to enter it out of order, and we're going to add a new pregnancy after the last pregnancy. And it's inserted the entry here. That's a single pregnancy. This one was a miscarriage. And we can say, let's say this was the 7th of August. Actually, we could say we don't know the day, but it was in August of 2021. And now this says that the pregnancy is not in order. So we've got the options of changing the date of delivery of this pregnancy, the date of prior delivery, or we can move the pregnancy. I'm going to move this pregnancy. And I'm going to move it before Beatrice. So I select Beatrice. And then it's going to ask me to confirm this. And yes, I want to move the miscarriage before the pregnancy of Beatrice. And notice how all of these messages are constructed based on all of the information that's been given. So the dates are completed from here. So now pregnancy is moved. Okay, and now we can continue the last bit of this entry. How long did the pregnancy last? Perhaps that was 3 months. Put in months. And there's no other pregnancy. Now we can come forward and continue completing the rest of this. We confirm the order of the pregnancies and that everything is complete. If it's the respondent agrees, we continue to the second set of questions over on the right here. Is Andrew still alive? Yes, he's still alive. His age is 2, and he's living with you. Yes. And you put in the line number from the household questionnaire. I actually have a mistake in here. I think that's, yeah, it's not going to like that. For the time being, I'm going to put in 00. It's checking something that I should have fixed earlier. There's no information then collected for the miscarriage in here. This is all about whether the child's alive and their age of death if they had died. Then we go on to ask about Beatrice, and Beatrice is not alive. And we ask how old Beatrice was when she died. And let's say she was 2 days old. So 2 days. So that's the collection of the pregnancy history, and that's how it works in the CAPI system. And these can get a lot more complicated than this example, but I wanted to give you a feel for how the collection can work. Okay, let's switch back to the presentation. So I just wanted to give you a few final conclusions about the use of the pregnancy history. I'm not sure conclusions is the right word. But the pregnancy history provides data that's not available from a birth history, particularly things like stillbirth rate estimates, possibly abortion rate estimates, and then information about antenatal care and delivery care for stillbirths as well as live births. But these are with the caveat that stillbirths, abortions, and miscarriages are often underreported, so you may be getting underestimates for these. So the work with the pregnancy history needs to be really carefully done to collect good quality data. So if you don't feel like you're going to get good quality data, I probably would avoid trying to use a pregnancy history. Remember that stillbirths and abortions are relatively rare events. Miscarriages are considerably more common, and there's definitely a greater need for care during interviewing and with the interaction with the respondent, because you're touching on some quite touchy subjects. Having said that, while the pregnancy history is more complex than a birth history, it's not significantly more complex. There is a somewhat added burden to the survey and to the respondents, but birth histories are complex anyway, so it's not a huge extra step. So I want to stop here. I hope this has given a picture of how pregnancy histories can be used and the experiences from DHS. And I think switch to any questions that there might be. So yeah, are there any questions? I haven't been looking at the chat, so
Thank you very much, Trevor. Yeah, we have some questions. I will try to read them as much as in detail as possible. There's one question to us as the UNICEF mixed team, the APM. I will leave it to the later part of the Q&A. I'll start with another one. Thomas is asking, can you comment a bit on what are the implications in terms of data quality of the change to a pregnancy story? I think you mentioned this, but he wants to know in terms of the implications to the fertility indicators, the indicators that we will be or you will be calculating at the end, for example, in the perspective of an artificial drop in TFR in the 3 to 5 years preceding the survey. So this is more about expectations in terms of what you will find for the fertility indicators. But you haven't seen much results, or in this round at least, but still, how is your expectations in terms of how the fertility indicators will differ or will not differ?
Well, this is a very interesting question because there's definitely concerns that it might affect things. Our hope is that by collecting a full history of all the pregnancies, that we would be getting fuller data perhaps than we might have done in the past. Although there's definitely a question mark. I think most people who've worked with pregnancy histories and birth histories have seen examples of where a miscarriage is, where a stillbirth was treated as a neonatal death, and vice versa, that a neonatal death was treated as a stillbirth. And so, there's definitely a concern. We're hoping that by collecting the full pregnancy history, that we can capture all stillbirths and all neonatal deaths, and we're not missing either. With the birth history, there was definitely the concern that some neonatal deaths were considered as stillbirths and were left out of the birth history. So we're hoping that they'll be more complete. Thomas's question is interesting because in the survey in the Philippines recently, we have seen what looks like a huge drop in the TFR in recent years. However, we've done some pretty extensive analysis of this, and this big drop seems to be real. And with a full pregnancy history, you can go back several years and compare to earlier surveys. And while we were initially quite concerned by the big drop that we were seeing, the data is actually incredibly consistent with the prior surveys, and does not appear to show a data quality problem at all, but rather seems to show a quite significant drop in fertility recently in that country. So that's one example. Most of the data, the KAR from that, the key indicators report for that survey is about to come out, but they've released some of the estimates, including the TFR, which is why I'm able to mention it. But most of the data using DHS 8 questionnaires has not come out yet, except for some in the they've come out in a few key indicator reports. So far, we're encouraged that it looks, the quality looks pretty good. Especially in this case, we were seriously concerned for initially when we saw the dramatic drop, but it looks to be real. So
Okay.
We're encouraged by that.
Thanks. Probably this is also responding to the last question we received in the chat box, so I will not repeat that. Another, actually two questions from Asnakesh, saying, as mentioned, giving training on birth history needs great care. So why do you merge or replace by pregnancy history instead of using or having both? First question. The second one is, do we use calendar method for calculating stillbirth for cross-checking in the upcoming DHS?
Okay, I don't understand the first question. Why you merge or replace?
My interpretation is, why don't you have a birth history and a separate miscarriage abortion history in the form of two different rosters rather than combining into one? That's how I read it.
Yeah, I don't think that's very natural for the respondent. We effectively had that in the past, although not completely. What we had in the past with the birth history and then the contraceptive calendar, and the contraceptive calendar was preceded by by collection of information about pregnancy losses, just within the calendar time period, which is about 5 to 6 years preceding the survey. The calendar was covered. We used to use that. We felt like that was underreported. We felt like we could get better estimates of stillbirth rates and hopefully better overall fertility and mortality data by combining it all into one raster. And we're still to see whether that's true or not. My best guess right now is that we're not seeing a lot of difference between the two in terms of the fertility and the mortality estimates.
And the second question was related to the use of calendar method to calculate stillbirth for cross-checking.
What do you, I don't understand that either. What do we mean by calendar method?
You have this calendar in DHS questionnaires,
Yeah.
and you are collecting monthly status of the woman. Are you going to compare the information with the pregnancy history? I mean, calendar.
Well, actually, the way the calendar is collected is the information is filled out. In fact, if I switch back, if I switch back to this screen briefly, this is the calendar here being filled out with the pregnancies. So the calendar was never collected separately. It was always all the information about the pregnancies in the calendar were all filled out through questions that were asked first. So the calendar is constructed, and you can see the construction happening here at the bottom of the screen. And then the gaps in between is where you ask about the contraceptive use. So so the two are automatically consistent because the calendar is, the pregnancies are filled out in the calendar automatically by the CAPI system.
Okay. Another question is from Jing Lui. Says it seems that it is much easier to run the CAPI system on a Windows computer instead of using CS Entry on an Android tablet, because it's much easier to go through the history roster on a Windows computer for inserting, deleting, record. So probably, I mean, the question is, or the comment is related to the use of Windows-based tablets as opposed to Android tablets. And maybe my question added to this, is there a progress on this for this round of DHS? Will you be using just Windows tablets, or is there a progress in terms of Android tablets having the same capabilities to record this module or history?
Yeah, there's an important difference between the Windows and the and Android operating system, and just to explain that, the Windows system uses a form, and this area here is called the form, and on that form you can have rosters, and then there's a space for the questions text to be shown for each individual question. On the Android system, you only see, you effectively do not see the form. What you see is the question here, and you see the response categories. So that makes it challenging when you're working with a roster to know exactly where you are in the roster. I should have prepped an Android version so I could actually show you that. I thought about doing it to show you that. I would say that with the Android operating system, it's the one downfall on the Android operating system for me that makes it a bit challenging is the fact you can't see rosters as easily as you can here. However, we built in some features, and this feature here, this pregnancy history button, this display here is works on Android as well as Windows, and so the interviewer at any point in time can display the full roster of the pregnancies at any point in time as they're doing the interviewing, and they can switch, from this back to just the questions, and then they can switch back to the pregnancy history whenever they want to. So it's a partial solution. You don't have the roster always showing as you do in Windows, but it is a sort of partial solution, getting you closer to the Windows feel here.
Mm-hmm.
I think though the Android is much simpler in general to use, and it's my preference to use the Android. The one limitation is the rosters, and we're gradually working to try and improve the way that can be done.
Okay, for this phase of DHS, is there going to be an optional thing to choose for the implementing agencies, for the countries to choose Windows tablets or Android, or are you going to enforce the use of one instead of this being an option?
Right. Historically, we've mostly worked with the Windows version, but we've increasingly been doing surveys in Android tablets. So, and let me see, in the past year, we used Android tablets in the surveys in the Philippines, in Liberia, there's an MIS, and the Kenya DHS used Android. And I'm probably missing one or two others. So I would say we were about half and half now, or getting close to half and half are Windows and versus Android. My preference, as I said, is Android, and I think we will probably be moving more fully to Android. There are some things that just work better in Android than in the Windows version, so I think we may be moving in that direction. Particularly if you want to do use mapping as part of your data collection system, the mapping is better on Android.
Good to know. Another question from Jacqueline. She's saying, how are the ethical applications of asking about miscarriages, abortions, stillbirths addressed? She's asking this because she joined late. Maybe she says she missed it. These could be potentially traumatic topics for respondents, which apart from the psychological implications, could also adversely affect the collection of any data that would follow this module. Any reflections on that? Mm-hmm.
Well, we're definitely aware of it. We are. It is something that's always addressed in training. Is how you talk about these topics with the respondents, because it's not just these. It applies equally to things like any child that died, and can apply to some other topics in the questionnaire as well. So interviewers are trained on how to respectfully and supportively talk about these topics with the respondent, so that it creates the least trauma possible. I would love to say that there isn't an issue with it, but yes, I mean, I think most of us who've worked in surveys have seen cases where a respondent gets upset as part of an interview. So it's something that's definitely covered as part of the training. It's an important element. It's always an important element about how you build rapport with a respondent and how the interviewers work with the respondent. And if you've seen a good interview is more like a very relaxed conversation. It doesn't feel like an interview, and providing that support to the respondent, as part of the process is an important element that we pay attention to.
Okay, maybe to connect this question, the first question we received, to what you are talking. When you start working with the countries, is this pregnancy history an optional thing, or is it mandatory to have? Will there be a chance for the survey teams to say, No, we don't want to do it. We just want to have birth history. How do you see it? Because the first question is related to whether the next round of mix will include something similar. Maybe I hear from you first, and then I comment on that one.
So the DHS 8 standard questionnaire now uses a pregnancy history, and that's the version that we go into discussions with. We start with that version of the questionnaire, and it's really we don't open up the topic of whether we choose a pregnancy history or birth history. Our default position is that we'll be working with a pregnancy history, as that's the current standard. And everything you do is based on standards. So
it's not even on the table, you are saying.
We don't put it on the table.
Okay.
If an organization if an organization says we don't want to use a pregnancy history, we want to use a birth history, we probably explain the pros and cons, and we would likely discourage it because it would actually be a big complication in the processes to revert back to a birth history. To date, that hasn't, I don't think it's even come up in the conversations that we've had so far, and we've probably got about a dozen surveys in DHS 8 that have finished either are somewhere in the fieldwork process or have finished fieldwork, something of that order. And to my knowledge, the issue has not come up.
Okay, thanks. For the mix program, we have more flexibility, especially if the demand comes from the country, from the implementing agency. We discuss, of course, we also have the same approach to stick to the standard questionnaires, standard modules, standard topics. Excuse me. But if there is a strong preference to go for something different, like we want to use pregnancy story instead of birth story, we try to allow that, but still the responsibilities are on the part of the implementing agency. So they have to find out all the necessary implications in relation to that decision. They have to set up their data collection system, training system, data analysis processing, etc. according to that. And the type of technical support we can provide will be depending on what we can provide them, because it's no longer part of the standard. So having said that, for the next round of Mix 7, we are planning to have a complementary module on this topic. The title will be something like abortions and stillbirths, but not in the form of a roster. It will not be part of something added to birth story so that it becomes pregnancy story, but rather in the form of a set of questions that we have seen in some of the past earlier mix round surveys in different parts of the world, but more in a standard manner and with all the standard necessary survey tools accompanying, starting from the training, analysis, reporting, etc. So this is something forthcoming, but in a different format, let me say. Okay, another questions from Gomez Albalina. In the questionnaire, you are also collecting data on behaviors that might result in undesired pregnancy outcomes. If so, how do you go about doing this? And is it in the pregnancy history section or in a different part of the questionnaire?
Yeah, we're not, if I'm understanding the question, we're not really collecting data on behaviors that might result in undesired pregnancy outcomes. Not quite sure what he means.
I think my interpretation is we are, or you are also collecting with the information about whether a pregnancy was desired or not. So
we certainly are collecting
yeah.
that. let me
So
just
is
show
it
you.
affecting the way you are collecting information in the pregnancy history?
That's not really collecting. No, that doesn't affect that. We collect information like that much later in section 4 of the questionnaire.
The issue might come up earlier in the pregnancy history, whether that pregnancy was wanted or unwanted, but that's not part of the recording or the information you are entering into the couple application. But later in the questionnaire, you are inquiring about that aspect as well, right?
Yeah, let me enlarge this slightly. Where's the... So this question here asks about did they want the pregnancy at that time or not? And that's in section 4 of the questionnaire, whereas the pregnancy history is in section 2. But just going back briefly, one comment about the choosing between birth history and pregnancy history. If we try to just replace the pregnancy history with the birth history, section 4 now refers to stillbirths in numerous places in this section, and we're collecting data on those, and it would be a little complicated to disentangle the non-live births from this section of the questionnaire.
Yeah, flow will be affected severely and negatively if you remove that part. Okay, fully understand.
We probably effectively have to go back to the DHS 7 questionnaire for the pregnancy history and for this section 4, if what they wanted to do that. I hope nobody wants to do that, though. It's a complication we don't need.
Okay, another question is from Lee Louis. Can you speak to the timeline for releasing additional DHS 8 data into the public domain? For example, how many are expected per year?
I don't have a good number per year. We're expecting to release probably 3 to 4 surveys probably in the next, I would say, 3 months. There's probably another 4 that would be released towards late summer, I think, and possibly a couple more towards the end of the year. So that may be, I'm guessing about 8 to 10 to come out this year. We've got, I'm not sure how many. We've got about 20 something surveys that are in various stages currently. And you can assume that probably about half that number will come out in any one year. So it's something of that order, I would guess.
Okay, thank you. We have a follow-up question, or actually comment from Bonjun, who asked about the mix-related inclusion of this topic. Bonjun is saying regarding the behavior implications, he's saying antenatal care take-up and stillbirth correlation could be explored. So he's suggesting this as a further analysis topic, I think, once we have this data.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that we're hoping to be able to look at, but be warned that stillbirths, it's a very small number, 1 to 2% of pregnancies. So we're finding so far that if we're looking at the ANC indicators, which typically cover pregnancies in the 2 years preceding the survey, we're finding that we've only got like 40 to 50 cases in that age range that are stillbirths. And in fact, it's probably less than 50 in most of the surveys that I've seen so far. So you've got a very, very small number you're working with. And in fact, if I showed if I go back to, whoops, to where the table was. So this table here, you see the antenatal care table, and this is true of a good number of tables. We we include the background characteristics for the live births, but then the stillbirths, we only provide a total, and for the combined live birth and stillbirths, it's only a total. There's just too few cases to disaggregate by any characteristics.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. One last question I see is from Lucia Huck. Thank you for the information, presentation, and highly appreciate for the work of UN IGME. Do you have any experiences if national definitions differ from the WHO definition for international comparison of 28 weeks or more of gestational age?
I believe so far all countries have agreed to use the 28-week definition, but I think it's come up as a discussion point in a couple of surveys that they have a national definition that uses often something quite a bit shorter than 28 weeks. But to my knowledge, I don't think any country has used that as the definition so far. I think everybody's agreed to use the international definition so far.
Okay. Thank you. I have a question. You partially responded to that, but I still bring it. In terms of the inconsistencies you will have from the first part of the fertility or mortality related questions, I mean the brass questions, and then you ask about the total number of miscarriages, stillbirths, and abortions, and you don't go back to do any corrections, but the interviewers have the chance or ability to do so if they want to, but it's not a requirement anymore. So this is putting more pressure on the analysis of the pregnancy history parts to come up with any calculation. So the first part will only act as a maybe check for quality, for other purposes. So the calculations will be specific to the pregnancy history part, the information you collected from there. And maybe if you can comment on that part, I have a follow-up question.
Yeah, that's effectively true. We're using, I think this was the original desire for the brass questions is and to use them as an introduction. Well, actually, I think the brass questions predate the use of birth histories, actually. But when they were first used with birth histories, they really were introduced as an introduction to the birth history to inform the respondent effectively of what we were interested in collecting and to try and collect some summary data that would allow for getting a complete birth history. And now we're using that in that same role in a pregnancy history. And to be honest, the reality is, all we're doing is just taking out one kind of unnecessary step. Yeah. In the past, an interviewer would be collecting the data, and then the respondent might add one extra birth or pregnancy into the pregnancy history, and then we would force the interviewer to go back and make a correction. Now we're saying you just don't need to go back and make that correction.
No, fully understand that. I mean, we are also having similar concerns, but this inconsistency in theory might go both ways. So you can find a higher number, which you don't force your interviewers to go back. But what if you find a lower number in terms of live births or miscarriages and abortions, etc.? I mean, what if you end up as an interviewer with a number less than that?
Then we do require them to go back and correct it.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we're using it as a lower bound. The idea being that when they're in the pregnancy history, it's not unusual for a respondent to mention a pregnancy that they've not previously mentioned. So adding an extra one, we shouldn't make it more difficult for the interviewer to add one. But we want to make it difficult for them to take one away.
Okay. Another question, again, in relation to the inconsistencies, you also ask about whether the child is living with the respondent, and then that also has implications to the household members. If that child declared as living with the respondent is not living in or not listed in the household members in the household questionnaire, do you do something about it or just ignore?
No, we
Is
do.
there a check?
There is a check,
Mhm.
and in fact, I have forgotten what data. There is a behind this example. There is a household interview that's been done, and I forget what's in the household interview. But when I tried to use, let's try and use the line number here. It was giving me an error message. Here because of
Okay.
you know,
Yeah,
this
there is a
this
warning.
is not consistent with what's in the household questionnaire. This one's giving me an out of range message. It looks to me like this household didn't actually have any children listed in it, which is why it's giving an out of range, because these are the only value that's acceptable here. Typically, though, if Andrew did live in the household, he would be listed in the household list, and his name would appear in this list to be selected here. But I was, for this example, I was just using some old data, and I didn't carefully check what was there in the household questionnaire.
Thank you very much. I don't see any more questions, so I ask my last question. You know, mixed as well, in detail, maybe not so very recently, but it has a lot of parallels. It has a lot of similarities to what you have in your questionnaires, especially for the topics that we discussed today. What would be your recommendation in terms of the next round of mix, including similar topics? Do you recommend, for example, a similar approach for pregnancy history instead of birth history? Any recommendations?
I would say that the benefits are relatively small. I think if I go to the conclusions again, whoops, where did it go? I went too far. Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a question of getting a bit more data than you had before versus some of the challenges that you have. So the bit more data is, you know, stillbirth rates, possibly abortion rates, but again, qualified by the fact that these may be underreported. Thinking about the complexities and the challenges, you know, stillbirths and abortions are relatively rare events. Miscarriages, these can be difficult things to talk about, so there's complexity there. Think about, can you get good quality data? Are you prepared to put in place really strong training, really good fieldwork monitoring to really pay attention to the details and try and ensure that you're getting good quality data? If you don't think you can get great quality data, I wouldn't use a pregnancy history. I'd stick to a birth history instead. Even with the birth history, you know, the quality of training and the quality of fieldwork monitoring are really important aspects in the overall quality of your data. So, you know, they should be there. They're kind of a minimum, I think, for using a pregnancy history.
Thank you very much. Very, very, very useful. Trevor, this has been great. Very useful presentation, a lot of insights, and not only for the mixed team, but for all the participants, I think. That's great. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your presence, and thanks to all. So I'll pass to Archana to wrap up and say the last few words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Turgay, and thank you so much, Trevor, for this great presentation and for staying with us for the full hour and 30 minutes. And I'd like to thank the participants for their great questions. Just like to remind everybody that the next webinar will take place on March 8th, and the topic is latest developments on collecting data on children's time use. So we look forward to having you participate in that as well. Also a reminder that the presentations and recordings will be available on the SharePoint site and on the Mix YouTube channel very shortly. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.